Okay, and welcome to the third session of Education in the United States. This is our final section on the history of education in the United States. Now we're going to focus more on contemporary issues after this. This week we also have our first seminar leadership, where you can find those questions in the discussion board section of our class. There's a thread labeled seminar leadership. We also have our first essential question. And remember, that needs to be received by me at midnight on Sunday, or should I say 12:01 Monday, where Sunday becomes Monday. So you have about 6 days to do that if you're looking at this on Monday. And you can find the essential question in the content folder. And remember the rubric, which you have a copy of as well, as you write it. 500 words maximum is our limit here. Okay? Let's just jump right into education in the 20th century. And it needs to be noted that this is not meant to be a comprehensive explanation of education during this time. It's a general overview of what I think are the most significant trends, moments, events, and people from the history of education over the last 113 years. For the rest of the course, you'll find that I lecture much, much less than I've done in these first 3 sessions, I promise you that. Okay, so we start with progressive education. Okay, and the progressive era of American history, those of you that are social studies teachers will note, it's from about 1890 to 1920, responding to those trends that we talked about in the last lecture. The themes of industrialization and urbanization propel earlier reforms in schooling only quicken during this time. Society becomes more complex, so too does its systems of education. There was mechanisms of social control of children that are loosened during this period of time, especially in the cities. Okay, so family, church, those things have allowed parents to have less control over their children. And of course, in the cities, this is an even bigger issue for parents, given that communities are much smaller now in terms of how many people, I should say larger in terms of the number of people, but smaller in terms of space. So there's a lot of different influences over young people. For immigrant children, attending schools at this time endowed them with skills that they could use on the job market. So education becomes to be a mechanism for assimilation for some immigrant children. Traditional ideas about religion were challenged by scientific advances, most notably, of course, Darwin's theory of evolution. And differentiation begins to occur. And by differentiation, I'm not talking about how we might commonly think that term is used, differentiated instruction. Rather, increasing volume in trade and a widening division of labor leads towards a specialization in the production of goods and services, meaning factories become more complex places to work. People get very, very, very specific jobs along an assembly line or within a mode of production. And so the type of training that they need is very specific to the job that they're going to do. Right? This leads to new economic and social roles for urban dwellers. It also begins to lead to a loss of a sense of community. Social relations become more impersonal. Social capital dissipates. Social detachment and isolation characterizes the new urban experience, right? Because if you do a specific task within a factory, you're likely to only socialize and interact with people who do that same task. The hierarchy between boss and workers becomes more stabilized and more distinct. There's also more diversity in the form of immigration, right? This is where you have the Chinatowns of American cities forming, the Little Italies of American cities forming, and other ethnic enclaves. And there's a growing inequality between owners and workers that leads to the threat of class warfare. Some examples of tense moments from this time: the Haymarket Square riots, for example, in Chicago. Other moments of extremism, political strikes becoming violent, and so on. Still, the wealthy become so powerful that their influence threatens to eclipse that of the federal government. So what does this mean for education? Well, schools become an even bigger public concern than they were in the past. Debates over how schools should cure societal ills rages. And there's not even an agreement between the so-called progressives. Right? The arguments that the progressives have at this time forever alters the landscape of American schooling. Now, Rory identifies two broad impulses in the movement of progressive education. We're going to see next week, though, I'm going to kind of challenge this idea and examine actually the four broad impulses in American education at this time that still have voice in our debates over why we school and how we school. But for the sake of simplicity, Rory's talking about two broad impulses more generally. The first impulse are what he calls the pedagogical progressives. They believe that education should be more responsive to the needs of the children. Some examples that Rory points out are John Dewey, Francis Parker, William Herd Kirkpatrick. Right? And Tyack is the historian who labels them the pedagogical progressives. The second impulse is administrative progressives. And they were concerned with making education more responsive to the needs of the economy. Right? Their big buzzword was efficiency. These folks are less visible than their idealistic counterparts, but just as influential on the schools. Actually, I would argue against Rory here and say they are more influential on the schools. Right? The pedagogical progressives, people like John Dewey, make names for themselves. People still read their books. They're well known today in education circles. But what they do in schools has a limited impact. The administrative progressives, however, design the schools that we come to know today. And the way that we understand education happening is still done the way that in many ways, the way that the administrative progressives argued should be done. These two camps have an uneasy coexistence. Right? They're kind of worried about different spheres of school, and the pedagogical progressives are concerned about the classroom instruction, the methodology, what's happening on a day-to-day basis. The administrative progressives were more concerned with the structures of schools themselves and the large-scale measurement of student learning. So while they don't agree with each other, they're not going after each other in public spheres either. They just sort of coexist. So a bit more about pedagogical progressivism. As I mentioned, they're concerned with the treatment of children in schools. They see schools as built like factories, which they truly are. They're poorly lit, cramped spaces, and these folks begin to question what kind of learning could occur in places like these. They begin to challenge traditional classroom methods, such as rote memorization, something we still struggle with today. Suggested children learn best by following their own instincts. Okay, and think back to Francis Wayland and his child-rearing concerns, almost the exact opposite advice for parents. They're influenced by academics like William James, a Harvard psychologist, who argue that children learn best through experience. And the best-known pedagogical progressive is this man on the right, John Dewey. He's briefly a teacher. A side note to that, he becomes very famous during his lifetime and well beyond. And so some reporters go back to Vermont, where he was from and where he briefly was a high school teacher. They track down his former students and say, so this John Dewey guy, who's a famous philosopher, what was he like when he taught you? And most of them laughed because they said that the class was disorganized, it was kind of a joke, they don't feel like they learned a whole lot in it. It was more like a chaotic experience for them. But he's most famous for his work at the University of Chicago's Laboratory School. He believed education was the interaction between the child and the curriculum, school, and society, right? So he didn't see these entities as separate, but all part of the fluid process. And in the lab school, he performed experiments in experiential education. Right? At the lab school, the children there would use the larger world as a classroom. They would do field trips, explore local communities. And the big concern for John Dewey was democratic education. Right? Democracy is a way of living. It's not just that you vote for leaders, it's that you live in a democratic manner. It's a collective existence that required a scientific and humanistic education. He believed democracy was the highest form of collective existence, and that the schools should model the values of a democratic society by being a microcosm for the community. So taking where Horace Mann was with this idea of, a non-denominational schooling and going several steps beyond it, saying, yes, that's great, non-denominational. Let's get rid of denominations together. It shouldn't be religious education. It should be a democratic education. Of course, he's influenced by the rapid changes in the cities he lived in. Okay, he starts his career up in Michigan, but he lives in Chicago and later in New York at Columbia University. And he sees these changes. He sees the tensions of a democratic society and a capitalist economy coming to fruition. He's, of course, concerned by what he's reading in the news. This inequality of wealth is a problem for him. And he believes schools could preserve the democratic values in a time of sweeping social change. And I'm guessing, based on your readings of the Pedagogic Creed and what you posted on the discussion board, that you're sensing these tensions. And you're sensing this impulse towards a democratic and a new way of educating children. Of course, he's not the only pedagogical progressive, he's just the most famous. Chicago becomes an epicenter for these ideas. So Francis Parker influences Dewey's work. He's a superintendent of schools in Quincy, Massachusetts. And in Quincy, they do away with rote memorization and focus on experiential learning. And when he hears about Dewey's work, he moves to Chicago and opens a private school where Dewey enrolls his own children. Jane Addams is another famous progressive. She's a social reformer, proto-feminist, suffragette. She's most famous for her work at the Hull House, which was a boarding house that educated immigrants in Chicago. And she and Dewey had a close friendship. They influenced each other. And I mentioned William Hurd Kilpatrick. He was a professor at Teachers College, which is Columbia's School of Education. So he and Dewey were colleagues there. Dewey was in the philosophy department, but they had similar overlapping research interests. And Kilpatrick develops the project method, where students pursue interdisciplinary topics of their interest, right? So rather than having a school divided by social studies and English and biology or the different school subjects, we merge them together because they looked at the disciplines and I said, well, historians don't just study history, they study other things as well in order to understand the past. And a biologist doesn't just sit in a lab, right? They have to write, they have to understand the work that's come before them. So they saw education as an inherently interdisciplinary process. And so this, eschews the traditional divisions of the subject matter. And the project method that Kilpatrick develops focuses on social issues outside the schools while developing traditional skills of reading, writing, math, etc. Some criticisms here. Well, you can probably imagine what they were, but critics were concerned that the basics were not being taught, that we focus on social issues or experiential education, and we ignore reading and writing, math, arithmetic, and so on. In addition, this seemed to benefit affluent children, who are more likely to learn these basics at home, right? So Dewey's kids went to these schools. The children of other professors went to the laboratory school, and sure, they got a great education, but they were learning those basic skills, that cultural capital, at home before they even got to school, which is sort of what made that experiential education possible. Others were concerned about a lack of discipline, a lack of order in classrooms, and they called this a trendy fad. Okay, the administrative progressives. This is a broad term. It's not a coherent group of reformers, and neither is pedagogical progressives, but that does a better job of describing what those people had in common than administrative progressives. It was a wide range of educators who were striving to make schooling more efficient. As you can imagine, mostly men. They were fiscally conservative members of society, or I should say it was fiscally conservative members of society who supported their efforts. They were larger in numbers than their progressive counterparts, their pedagogically progressive counterparts. And many of the features that they created can be found in today's school system. I think a lot of it will be familiar to you. Broadly put, their goals were this. They were not trying to alter society through schools or overcome social problems. That was not their concern. Rather, they wanted to adapt schools to the rapid changes of industrialization, right? So So you see how these progressives stand at odds with each other. The pedagogical progressives see a problem in society and hope schools can fix it. The administrative progressives see a problem in the schools in terms of their ability to keep up with society and hope to fix the schools. They're concerned with, primarily, efficiency. They wanted rationally organized and cost-effective school systems. They wanted to curb corruption and the misuse of public funds that characterized schooling leading into the 20th century. And they wanted to reform the basic structure of school districts. Right? So at this time, coming out of the Gilded Age, school districts were run by political appointees. And the administrative progressives began this reform process of having publicly elected school boards or councils that were administered by superintendents. Sounds a lot like what we are experiencing today. They also oversaw the consolidation of rural schools into larger districts with central administrations. Now, this effort doesn't really fully take hold until, when we talk about society being impacted by schools and so on. This is, to me, just a funny little thing. These rural school districts don't come together until we have gas-powered school buses. And only then is it possible to get children from all over the place to come to one central location. Differentiation was also a big buzzword of the day. They saw differentiation of skills and needed skills as an inevitable feature of the modern social order. Schools could make the process of specialization and differentiation unfold more rationally. Right? So they believe that schools ought to develop different goals for different students. Mostly this plays out in high schools. They wanted to help young people prepare for the labor market, so they're not so concerned with democratic living in the same sense that Dewey is. And they call this vocational education. Home economics, manual arts, other training curricula. Okay, and this all goes along with this idea of social efficiency. They thought schools should have the ability to endow students with appropriate knowledge and skills, and the process of classifying students according to achievement. This leads, or their influence leads, to the growth of educational bureaucracies. Increasingly complex rules of resource allocation govern schools, as you can see in this chart, which is pretty typical for how a school district is run. The school systems in general are run in this country. Now, the idea of this really was a democratic idea, though. They saw corruption, they saw waste, and they hoped to create a model for realizing the greatest possible good from a limited set of assets. Okay, this historian, David Tyack, who I keep referencing, he calls this the one best system. They were all working on. The book that David Tyack writes about this is called Tinkering Towards Utopia, right? This idea that they could reform until they got the perfectly running school system. The key to this was measurement. They developed standardized and psychological testing. This is a bureaucratic impulse towards numerical precision and classifications. And they, when the IQ test is developed for the Army during World War I, they see that as a way to begin classifying students at an early age. Of course, the mental testing movement holds implications for children with special needs or learning disabilities, who, if they're identified, are largely put in their own classrooms or segregated. You have to understand disabilities at this time were not well understood. Right? This is a new degree of differentiation with these new special classes developed for them. Of course, this often leads to ethnocentric or racist backlash, and in the most extreme cases, there is a call for sterilization of feeble-minded individuals. Right? The eugenics movement pops up at this time. Now, organized labor opposed measures that threaten the livelihoods of teachers. I'll talk a little bit more about the teaching profession and when the unions come into play in a few sessions. There's resistance towards measures that reduced funding by community groups. I should say community groups resisted these measures that reduced funding. Working class parents were often suspicious of vocational education curricula. They worried that their children were being boxed in or pigeonholed. And their reforms were as controversial as those suggested by the pedagogical progressives. But they were supported by wealthy donors and political elites, so they are generally successful. Now, it's during this time that we see the birth of the modern high school. Secondary schools were also rapidly expanding at this time, and efforts were made to bring some uniformity to the secondary schooling experience. All right, so the first step towards this in 1893 is the Report of the Committee of Ten, which was written by a committee led by Charles Eliot from Harvard. He was commissioned by the National Education Association, which you now recognize probably as a teachers' union, which was not a teachers' union at the time. It's chaired primarily by traditional academics, and they recommended an academic curriculum for all students. They saw preparation for college and life as one and the same. They did not agree with the administrative progressives in vocational education. All right, so this is sort of the first curriculum for high school students. They lay out the subjects, the topics that should be covered, and in a scope and sequence in the secondary curriculum. In 1918, you had the Kingsley Commission, right, which was formally titled the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education. Now, the Kingsley Commission advocated a differentiated curriculum, but they also wanted to bring together students of different backgrounds, right? So there'd be core courses that everybody would take and specialized courses that would be taught for students who wanted to take them. Right? This is kind of a commingling of both branches of progressive education. These two reports offer contrasting ideals for secondary education. Now they're fully taking hold at this time, so you can probably see evidence of both in your own schooling. It's at this time that the traditional high school is transformed from an elite institution into an egalitarian institution. Right? I spoke about this last week, that it was primarily the children of the elites who would go to high schools. Well, that begins the process of dying away. Now, it doesn't really take hold till after the Great Depression, but it starts here, especially after the 1920s. Having a high school diploma was increasingly seen as a way to get ahead. White-collar jobs, as well as administrative jobs and manufacturing, became available. And these institutions became a key link, meaning high schools became a key link between the nation's economy and the education system. So what were the experiences of outsiders like at this time? The benefits of progressive education were not available to everyone, and at times served to hamper the educational prospects of students from certain social groups. All right, so women's secondary education. What you have to understand is the logic of coeducation, meaning the logic that boys and girls should be educated in the same buildings, if not always at the same time, has never been seriously challenged by any reforms in the United States. But still, there were people who argued against boys and girls learning together. For example, G. Stanley Hall, a psychologist, argued that coeducation threatened young males' masculinity. So groups began writing curricula specifically designed for boys and specifically designed for girls. This differentiation between boys and girls. All right, vocational courses for women were developed. Home economics, stenography, typing, bookkeeping. Right, so they knew, these reformers knew there was no way they were going to untangle male and female coeducation in a general sense. So what they wanted to do was, within these coeducational institutions, begin the process of separating the sexes. And so these courses defined acceptable occupations for women following high school. And they were praised by administrative and pedagogical progressives alike. For African Americans, patterns of discrimination from the 19th century became even more pronounced. Blacks began to move to northern cities after 1910, especially during World War I. It's called the Great Migration. In the South, life remained harsh, the school year was short, and resources were limited. African American children rarely attended high school despite the rapid expansion of white high schools in the South. Black high schools that did exist followed a Tuskegee-based curriculum, which we talked about last week. That basically means there was a lack of academic options and training to African American youth at this time. Thus, African American youth missed out on a crucial step in the human capital revolution as a result. We see similar patterns for Hispanics. Right? They face similar discrimination in the southwestern and western states as blacks did in the South. Even in desegregated schools, discrimination persisted. Right? Language barriers prevented students from taking academic courses. Occupational opportunities were limited to agricultural jobs. And schooling did little to change this. And it's kind of a negative mark against especially the pedagogical progressives, is that these people are largely ignored by the pedagogical progressives. John Dewey himself, he's a founding member of the NAACP, and his supporters will point to his participation in that organization as evidence of his very progressive thinking on the topic, but he very rarely wrote about this massive discrimination that he was well aware of, and rarely advocated outside of his membership in the NAACP. Okay, fast forwarding to the second half of the 20th century. So let's bring ourselves up to speed, the human capital revolution. So following World War II, formal education took on an even more important role. It became a matter of both public and private concern. It becomes acknowledged as a primary factor in national economic growth. And schools become at this time an instrument of federal social policy. So as you listen to this, I want you to think about where we started, or even think about Horace Mann's attempts at bringing together a common school system in Massachusetts, to the later half of the 20th century, where you have schools and programs that are administered by the federal government. Right? It's a massive, sweeping change. So some context for these changes. And again, I'm not going to get into details here because I actually will later in the class. There's a loosening of racial and sexual ideologies at this time. Part of this is owed to the Civil Rights Movement, largely acknowledged to begin with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, though of course the social movement existed long before that, but this is considered one of the first large-scale successes. Education remains a critical focal point for the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement. And so think about that. The first major victory in the Civil Rights Movement happens when it comes to schools. It's not so much busing, though busing becomes a famous focal point of the Civil Rights Movement, right? But it's through the schools. You also have Cold War concerns and a foreign policy increasingly concerned with winning the hearts and minds of South Americans, Africans, and Asians, right? As the Soviet Union and the United States do battle for their spheres of influence in the so-called Third World, the fact that the U.S. exists in a discriminated system, that Jim Crow system in the South, is an embarrassment to policy leaders. And the Soviets are well aware of this and point out that the U.S. is not this egalitarian society. Of course, fighting the Soviets and later first the Nazis and later the Soviets causes many Americans to reconsider the intolerance that exists in the United States. You also have, during and immediately following World War II, the second Great Migration. Right? The changing social and ethnic demographics in major metropolitan areas as a result of so many young Americans being away at war, and large number of African Americans again moved to northern cities. There's also the development of the youth culture, which we're going to talk about later in this course. Boom in birth rates following World War II, the so-called baby boomer generation, and teens begin to shape the evolution of courtship practices that play out in the hallways and classrooms. And of course, an ever-changing occupational landscape. Developments in technology require more training for many jobs. College enrollments swell to account for this shift. So returning to a topic that was briefly discussed earlier in this lecture, this idea of race equity in education. This time you have something called the urban crisis. Right? Following World War II, waves of African Americans flee de jure segregation. De jure segregation refers to segregation by law. De facto segregation refers to segregation that's in place simply because of people's social practices, where they live, who they work with, who they socialize with. Right? So many African Americans are escaping de jure segregation in the South only to find de facto segregation in the North. And in many places, de facto segregation is more difficult or more extreme in the North than de jure segregation in the South. Think about it. It's easy to get rid of de jure segregation if you make a law. We'll pause this for 1 minute. Apologize for that delay there. So what you have as these African-American families begin to move to northern cities is white flight from those cities and the growth of what we now call suburbia. And in essence, this urban crisis creates two school systems with unequal funding, unequal organization, and unequal success rates. As a result, you have significant social unrest, launching of boycotts of this school segregation. A response to this is the busing movement, right? Students were bused to high schools within cities to curb this de facto segregation. Because if you go to a neighborhood school and your neighborhood is primarily of one racial group or ethnic group, right, that's de facto segregation. They bust students around the cities to try and commingle them. The failure of this, however, revealed the impossible ideal of public schools as a microcosm for society. Thus, in the decades since the 1950s, the gap between suburban and urban schools has become even more distinct. So some policy moves by, especially the federal government, aimed at education and impacting positively social change include the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. This is an integral piece to Johnson's war on poverty. Right? It was a way to grant assistance to urban school districts who had lost their tax base to the suburbs. Okay, so if you're unaware of how public schools are funded, schools are primarily funded through property taxes. The more valuable property, the higher the tax rates, right? The more tax dollars that are coming in, hence the better funded schools. Well, in urban centers with lower property rates, you have lower property taxes, and you also have more difficult problems, larger population. And so the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was a way to set aside federal dollars to try and make up for that gap in funding. Title I money you may have heard of set aside federal tax dollars to schools serving significant numbers of students from high poverty backgrounds. Now think about this. Think about how different the funding is between elementary and suburban and urban schools. This act made the differences in funding between suburban and urban schools less severe by about half. It doesn't provide equal funding. So think about where we are now and where we would be if we didn't have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Okay, whatever that gap in funding is, you can basically double it. A program not without controversy, Head Start, also by Lyndon Baines Johnson, also in 1965. It's a federally funded preschool program for children of poor families. There's questions over the effectiveness of Head Start, and some complain of a lack of educational content in Head Start programs. Still, the war on poverty has left a lasting mark on the expectations for the federal government to intervene on issues of education and inequality. In addition, the role of special education has changed dramatically since the 1950s. Right? Beginning in the early 60s, research on learning disabilities begins to inform educational practice and policy. So between 1948 and 1968, the number of students classified as requiring special education increases from about 400,000 to 2 million. And prior to this, students with special needs were simply put in their own classes. But the more that educators began to understand about certain disabilities, the more possible it was for these young people to get an education while staying in a mainstreamed classroom. And the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 requires schools by law to provide the least restrictive environment possible for children with special needs. That is, if at all possible, to not have these children in separate classrooms. Finally, Title IX was a 1972 amendment to federal education legislation. It focused on gender-based discrimination in schools. So if schools had gender-based discrimination, that would lead to a loss of federal funding. This Title IX is a policy that was felt mostly in women's athletics, in terms of supporting financially girls' teams for sports. Textbooks were also revised to feature fewer stereotypes, but vocational courses remained divided along gendered lines. So there were some political controversies involving educational policy from this time. Not everyone lauded these reforms that aimed at leveling the playing field for poor and urban schools. Some worried these initiatives would cause the schools to lose focus on academic achievement. Others claimed that a focus on diversity posed a threat to scholastic standards. So I mentioned busing earlier. Federal and state authorities in the North and West enforced the busing policies to integrate urban schools. Busing was met with anger and conflict, mostly from white parents who complained of the ending of neighborhood schools. And President Nixon, running for re-election in 1972, enacts what he called his Southern strategy, which focused on Southern whites' anger over desegregation, and really went after the busing policies. All right, and here's where we begin to see a sway from white Southerners voting primarily Democratic to voting primarily Republican. Affirmative action, I probably don't need to speak a whole lot of affirmative action. I'm sure you all know about this. The idea behind affirmative action is that groups that have been the objects of discrimination in the past should be permitted first consideration for opportunities in the present and future. This primarily affects admissions to post-secondary institutions. It becomes, and still is, a focal point for the public debate over equity and access to resources. And there's a very harsh conservative political reaction to many of these reforms. Debates over educational reform policies helped propel Ronald Reagan into the White House. While running for president in 1980, Reagan vows to limit government intrusion in the lives of individuals, and he appealed to those who were critical of these reforms. Reagan promises an end to the federal government in education, including a dismantling of the Department of Education altogether, or at least removing it as a cabinet-level position. And though he runs and wins on a lot of this rhetoric, he's ultimately unable to significantly alter the federal government's role in education, which demonstrates how firmly entrenched this type of programming had become in the logic of the public discourse. Finally, the Nation at Risk report sends shockwaves through the field of education, American politics, that are still being felt today. It's a 1983 report written by Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, Terrence Bell. He doesn't personally write it, but he commissions it. It calls for a massive reform in American schooling, focusing on higher standards of performance. Polls at the time demonstrate that the public was concerned about the declining educational performance as connected to the competitiveness of the American economy worldwide. Right? The idea here, the big takeaway, is that schooling was too important for the federal government to not play some role in it. So that's what's interesting about the Nation at Risk report, is that it's a fairly conservative document written by an organization that Reagan himself wanted to dismantle. But its final conclusions, beyond that American schools are failing American children, is that American schools, or I should say the federal government, needs to play some kind of role in schooling, because the language of the Nation at Risk report, if you read it, is very, it's warlike. They say if an enemy did to our schools what we've done to them themselves, we would declare war on them. But because we've done this to ourselves, there's no one to declare war on. The rhetoric is very, very harsh. And so people become massively concerned that, the Soviet Union, Japan, Germany, those schools from a technological, mathematical standpoint are going to overtake American schools. So kind of bringing us to the present day, education and the labor market. Well, the movement from a manufacturing economy to a technology and service-based economy has ultimately meant a change in the way that we view schooling. Even higher levels of education become expected just for employment. White-collar positions in offices begin to replace manufacturing jobs in factories starting in the 1960s. Thinking and analytical skills were cultivated at schools, or so the logic goes. In the first half of the 20th century, it was common for people under 20 to seek full-time employment. This shifts dramatically after the Great Depression, as high school attendance soars. Finding a job became much more complicated. The movement away from a manufacturing economy means the relevance of vocational training weakens. Literacy becomes a bare necessity in all workplaces, especially after the 1960s. Urban poor, African Americans in particular, are poorly prepared by their schooling for this reality. And these concerns are reflected in the EntNation Risk report. So what does this mean? Well, for higher education, dollar returns for college graduates increases in the 1980s and 1990s. More significantly for our concerns, wages for high school dropouts declined sharply. This doesn't mean that high school dropouts are automatically relegated to careers of failure, but it's certainly a lot more difficult to be financially successful and independent without a college degree. And college degrees become a valuable commodity, and a high school diploma an absolute necessity. Women began participating in the workforce in much larger numbers starting in the 1970s and 1980s. Possibly, this is as a result of Title IX, and female attendance rates in college increases accordingly. But at the end of the 1990s, the female rate at college entry is 10% greater than that of men. So what does this mean, especially for us today? Well, these changes can be interpreted as a rational response to the shifting economy. The shifts highlighted the disparities of schooling in suburban and inner city districts. And it also reflects the impact of the human capital revolution. The emphasis in the closing decades of the 20th century was on academic skills. This educational mismatch between the educational expectations of employers and the schooling of urban students has been an impetus for school reform since the 1980s. This is an era of dramatic, sweeping changes. If you can think about how long America did not have a common school district to when it becomes a very, very organized school district taking funds and policy cues from the federal government. Well, these historical developments help shape the relationship between social change and education. You have ideological shifts in racism and sexism. Schools become instruments of federal social policy, seen as a way of helping individuals become members of mainstream society. There's the development of a youth culture, which I'm going to talk about later in class. Formation of large schools may have worked in concert with this factor to erode adult authority. Shifts in the economy moved away from the differentiated curriculum towards an academic and uniform curriculum. Note that we haven't spoke much about recent developments and trends in schools and education policy. These first 3 sessions were meant more as a primer for the discussions that are going to follow. Your other readings for this week, Baines and Foster and Boyer, are more examples of philosophies of education, like the ones you read by Dewey and Rogers. Note the years that these documents were written and the context in which the authors lived. Also, continue to think about your own philosophies of education in light of these arguments. Okay, but I'm not going to speak so much about Baines and Foster and Boyer because you have a discussion, a seminar leadership online You also have your first essential question. So make sure you download that, respond to that in between 450, 500 words. Make sure you're following the rubric, and you email that directly to me by Sunday night / Monday morning. Any questions can go on the discussion board.